Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 36. And today I am super excited to be joined by Andrew Locke. And if you're a .NET developer and you aren't subscribing to his blog, then you really should. In a recent episode with Nick Chapsas at the start, I said that Nick's YouTube channel was a must subscribe for .NET developers. And on the blogging front, I can generally say the same about Andrew's blog, covering tons of .NET topics from ASP.NET to source generators to Kubernetes and more. So thank you, Andrew, so much for such an awesome resource and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on here. I've been listening to all of the podcasts, so big fan.
Oh, wow. That's good to hear. Yeah, it's an honour to have you on. So could you give our listeners a quick introduction?
Sure, yeah. So I started programming with .NET probably about 10 and 12 years ago now, I guess. It was back at the .NET 3.5 sort of time. I was relatively late to it. I only sort of discovered programming when I was at university. So from that point, .NET was kind of a default for me after I had dabbled with C++ a little bit. Suddenly seeing the light of a garbage collector was wonderful. So that was sort of my start in it. And then I really dabbled with ASP.NET and a little bit with web forms, a little bit with WinForms, things like that. It was only when .NET Core was on the horizon that I properly started to dig into that and started blogging about it, which I guess was about 2016. So, yeah.
Yeah, you just brought flashbacks of C and C++ days now. I unfortunately started there, and you mentioned garbage collectors, like not having that, and pointers and all this kind of stuff. So, yeah.
It's a revelation. And in some ways, I'm glad I started with C and C++ because it's really nice to know the sort of the underpinnings of everything, knowing exactly how memory is managed, the effect of caches, and all this sort of thing, which you generally don't have to care about, but it's nice having that background there. And so I like knowing it's there and then not having to think about it at all.
Yeah, I think even like performance, I know some of your blog posts are about performance, just in C and C++, I don't want to say you have to think about it more. I guess it's because my background was in the games industry, so you definitely had to think about it then. But just, yeah, as you say, just understanding how things work behind the scenes when you've not got something like .NET doing it all for you is quite nice.
Yeah, absolutely.
So before we dig in, let's do this episode's listener mention. And this one goes to Joel Hammond Turner, who tweeted out, "On a sun lounger catching up on Drakan's Unhandled Exception podcast. How's your Easter Sunday going?" So thank you for your tweet, Joel. It's not often in the UK that we get to talk about sun loungers, that's for sure. For my Easter, I had quite a relaxing weekend glamping in Pembrokeshire with lots of walks, beach trips and barbecues. And we also did axe throwing, which the glamping site did this session on axe throwing, and I found it quite worrying that my 8-year-old son was surprisingly good at it.
It's just risky. You get yourself set up for something there.
Well, I think that's it. My throws were like slightly less on target, but his were like spot on. So scary. And if you want to get mentioned on the show, just send a tweet using hashtag #UnhandledException. All feedback is greatly appreciated. And I am Drakan on Twitter, which is DRACAN. So we vaguely said on Twitter that we were going to chat about ASP.NET Core and blogging. However, I have a feeling, as often is the case with this podcast, that we'll probably go on lots of different tangents and things, especially given the topics you blog about. I know you've done a series on hosting ASP.NET or running ASP.NET in Kubernetes, which is a topic you're going to struggle to keep me away from.
Yeah. I mean, the blogs, they go everywhere because it's typically just what I've been working on during the day. If I struggle with an issue, I normally just make a note of it to just write about it later. It gives you lots of things to write about. I've got like this endless list of hundreds of topics, but there's a lot going on there.
That's so useful. Like an example, one of your recent posts was about Git Worktree. And I knew Git Worktree existed, but I just hadn't really used it. And since reading your post, I've started using it quite a bit now. And it's just things like that where it's just so valuable.
Well, there's a sort of a double-edged thing with it as well. It's useful for other people to have a look at, but honestly, I hadn't really looked at Git Worktree until I wrote that blog post. I vaguely had an idea about it, but then it was only when I started using it that I was like, actually, this probably is useful. And it forces you to dig into it and actually try and learn it.
Yeah, that's kind of what I found with blogging as well when I did it, when I used to do it. That, as you say, it forces you to learn it deeper and have a better understanding of it. But yeah, since starting the podcast, I've not really had time to do much blogging, so only so many hours in a day and all that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with ASP.NET Core, this kind of obviously covers a lot of stuff. There's like web APIs, MVC, Razor Pages, Blazor, Minimal API, and various other bits and bobs. For the listeners that are completely new to web development in .NET, how would you define the term ASP.NET Core?
That is an annoyingly difficult one. The second post I ever wrote on my blog back in 2016 was, what is the difference between .NET Framework, .NET Core, .NET Standard? It's so confusing for newcomers, I think. I mean, we're kind of lucky these days in that .NET Standard has gone away to an extent, although it hasn't, so there is that. ASP.NET Core is a web framework with web inverted commas because it covers not just HTTP, there's gRPC, there's all these different aspects to it. I mean, typically everyone's going to think of it as a web framework, so that's where you'd start.
So it's kind of how you do web development on .NET.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I guess you've also got with .NET Core, or can't call it that anymore, .NET 6 Plus, then you've also got all the underlying things like dependency injection, all this kind of stuff. And one thing I really like nowadays is most of these things you build, whether it's a console app, whether it's a web app, whether it's a web API, is pretty much a console app under the hood.
Absolutely.
So it just feels like really consistent.
Yeah, it was a great starting framework. I mean, that's been there since 1.0. It was always sort of designed to be essentially just a console app hosted in a console app, which came even earlier from the Owen and Katana work that was done in .NET Framework. But that model of it not being tied to IIS, not being tied to any particular deployment, just makes it so much simpler. And all of those, as you say, that dependency injection, the hosting model in general, that all started with ASP.NET Core, but now it's sort of, they're all hosted in the runtime repositories and things, and they're all under the extensions namespaces because then they're not anything ASP.NET Core specific now. So while ASP.NET Core was the start, they've managed to pull out huge amounts of it just down into the sort of lower framework, which has some cons in that it's maybe stifles some sort of open source contributions. I know there's been various people have commented that to the dependency injection container, it's like a lowest common denominator, essentially. It doesn't leave space for other frameworks to hook in. But as a consumer and as a user of it, honestly, it's been really nice just to know exactly how to use all these different libraries because they can all plug into this one central low level framework.
Yeah, I think with IOC containers, this has come up in a few past conversations as well. Steve Collins did an episode on this. And yeah, you're right. It's kind of like, for me, I used to use Autofuck as a IOC container, and now I just use out of the box. And whilst that's great for me as a user, because it just works out of the box, and all my apps are the same, and it's just file new project and I get it. You're right. It's kind of stomping on a lot of open source projects where obviously those people have spent an awful lot of their spare time.
Yeah, it's a difficult one because, as you say, people have spent a lot of time on it, and there's various aspects where it's could be done better. Like there's more functionality, there's extra things you need. I don't know. I mean, open source is always such a difficult can of worms. Really, there's the funding open source as a support there and how it all works. And .NET has a ragged history, shall we say, with essentially Microsoft being the de facto that everyone goes to. And the trouble is, I feel like I'm as guilty of this as anyone. Like I really like open source. I will help stuff. I have some open source libraries, but if there's a first party option, I'll normally take it, mostly because it's the easiest and it becomes a default. Yeah, it's interesting.
I think it's also easier when you're trying to introduce something into new teams. Like, I'm a consultant, so I work with different companies, and it's quite hard for me to go in and say, you should be heavily depending on this library, which you might not have heard of, and it's not out of the box. It's not Microsoft. It really depends on the company themselves as well.
Yeah, that's true.
You mentioned Owen, and you started touching on the history and how things have changed.
Yeah.
with Owen introduction, you then got the startup.cs, which is probably quite familiar to what it is now. And then I think in some projects that even that's going away. So we've got the program.cs. Could we talk a bit about the history and how all that's evolved over the different iterations of ASP.NET?
Yeah, sure. So as you say, yeah, so Katana and Owen was meant to be it was the next evolution of web APIs in .NET Framework. So in .NET Framework, you had MVC, which is the classic way of writing server-side HTML rendering. And then you had the web API stack, which was completely separate from MVC, except almost the same. Like it used a lot of the same sort of concepts, but the controllers were separate. There were completely different types, different namespaces. So you could host that inside your iOS apps as you liked. But then later on, using Owen and Katana, you could also host in a service, in a Windows service, or in a console app again. So it's definitely a precursor to ASP.NET Core. And you had the concept of middleware as well. That's where that sort of originated from. It was a bit clunky, the horrible sort of delegates you had to pass around that were not fun to use, but it was clearly the precursor to ASP.NET Core. And then in 2016, I think it was, when that was when ASP.NET Core was released, it was 2016. A lot of that was essentially there in the first version. You had the middleware pipeline is the central design. As you say, you've got the startup. Big difference from now looking back at ASP.NET Core, you had the Project JSON originally, the beloved Project JSON.
The listeners can't see my expression when you said that then.
Yeah, this was meant to be the way of solving the horrible CS proj files which we had at the time for ASP.NET. And it was going to be JSON and beautiful because everything was JSON. And that lasted, I don't know, a couple of months, I guess it was. In the end, they actually released the 1.0, I think, with Project JSON, and then I think it was a Visual Studio release. They tore it out and replaced it with CS Proj.
It must have lasted even a tiny bit longer than that, because I kind of ended up with projects with it in, and then it's like, oh, we're going back again then.
Yeah, and it made sense to go back in the end, because the original plan of, we're going to start from scratch just wasn't really practical as the whole. I mean, if you look at where they are now, where we've got WinForms and WCF, WPF ready on .NET Core and things, and trying to rebuild all of that in a completely new build set was never going to work. So it made sense, but it definitely, there was churn at the start of ASP.NET Core. Definitely churn.
I think there's got to be with such a big change as well. And I think the nice thing is, because it is open source, then you can get, even though there was that churn, there was mediums for people to give feedback and see the discussions on GitHub and all this kind of thing. So it's it might have been the fact that if there wasn't this churn and it was done more, I'm going to use the term waterfall, but without visibility, then we might be in a completely different place now, and not as nice a place.
Absolutely. And you can definitely see them sort of learning as we go through the different versions. So the other thing in version 1.0 was essentially everything was a NuGet package. Every single feature that you wanted in ASP.NET Core was going to be a NuGet package. So you could basically only use what you needed, and your apps would be that much smaller, because if you're not using XML, you don't pull in the XML package. If you're not using, I don't know, some sort of other Azure configuration or something, you don't pull in that NuGet package, and your app would stay very small. The only trouble with this is you end up with about 40 packages in your project, each with slightly different version numbers as well, because they weren't versioning them consistently. They were versioning them correctly in that if a package didn't change when there was a new release, so a sort of a patch release, then they didn't bump the package versions. But that meant if you were going to be using a 1.0.1 app, that would mean that some of your packages were on 1.0, some of them were on 1.1, and you basically had no way of knowing which was which. So they tried to work around it with sort of meta packages that combine that, but ultimately that whole idea sort of went away in later versions, because it was just too difficult to manage.
It's interesting you mentioned about packages as well. I know there was a recent announcement with something called, I think, Central Package Management or something, which sounds like you can just manage the version centrally for projects. I know you've been able to do this for quite some time with like props files or whatever targets. Oh, I can't remember, but I believe this is slightly different in the sense of it doesn't force those packages on the projects.
Yeah, that lets you set. So if you're using Newtonsoft JSON, say in 3 of your projects, instead of having to update the version number in each of those projects when you upgrade, you just set it centrally in this one place. So it looks for, if this package is installed, use this version. That is quite nice. And yeah, there was a directory props thing I was using years ago, but the trouble was that things like Visual Studio and they didn't know about it. So if you updated in the UI, then it would nuke all of those versions and mess everything up.
I think it also depends what type of project you're dealing with. If you're doing like a microservice kind of architecture, deploying things to Kubernetes, you might have completely different Git repositories. So where does that live?
I don't think it makes sense for that. I think it's really just for a solution level, in my opinion. I think if you're doing microservices and they are separate, then you don't want that necessarily. The whole premise in some ways is that you can version things separately. You can upgrade one app without upgrading another. I mean, you may have sort of security implications and policies in place that you do want to upgrade them all, but fundamentally the apps are versioned separately. Whereas this is more of if you've got a big solution with 30 projects and you upgrade a project, you don't want to have to go through and update them all. Because if you miss one as well, then suddenly your find and replace doesn't work, and now you get into a big mess. I know. It's happened.
Learning the hard way, I like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you said about microservices. I guess that I'm trying to think of other examples where, so like for example, where you've got editor config, where you're setting up styles, which maybe you want to apply across the entire company. Say you've got conventions in place with the whole multiple Git repository, like where do you put that? But yeah, definitely with a central package versioning, each one should be managing when they upgrade independently.
Yeah, that's true. That is interesting, actually. The editor config thing was something. So when I was working at a previous company, we were creating lots of small apps. I don't know if you would call them microservices or not, but they were definitely sort of small applications. And there's a lot of boilerplate stuff there you do. So I created this .NET New template, which is using the SDK. But there was this constant problem with we'd tweak things and update the template, but then you've already got all these apps out there which are using an old version of the template. How do you update all those? And I never got beyond just brute force going into every single app and doing it manually. But it feels like there's, in a similar way, it feels like there's some sort of central way you'd like to be able to update them. But maybe that's pie in the sky, I don't know.
It's interesting with where you said what is a microservice as well, with more modern ways of doing software development, where you might have like a Spire application, which might be Blazor, Angular, Vue, or whatever, and then you've got maybe 2 APIs in the back end. And you might have a worker process, which is doing all a cron job or whatever. So those are separate things. But is that a microservice architecture? Probably not. It's just the way you do web development nowadays.
Yeah, it's true. Like I said, I'm not sure where you draw the line, and people get very dogmatic about the different things. We tried to use this sort of the domain-driven design kind of style, like you have your boundaries and trying to separate them like that, so that everything's consistent within a boundary. Things are messy.
Yeah, it's interesting going back. You mentioned about CS Proj and these JSON files, where it temporarily went to that and then back again. One nice thing when it went back again was the new style of CS Proj, where for the very old style, where you've got basically a list of all the CS files in the project, where now it's kind of implicit. And they're just so much cleaner now, and you can just manually edit them. It's just so much better.
Absolutely, I completely agree. It's so simpler, and it's funny. It's just that almost that one small change of not listing every file just made a complete difference. They've done lots of other tweaks and things as well, but that simple thing, it just completely changes them.
Yeah, even like merge conflicts where multiple team members are working on the same thing, and then they add a new file which might be somewhere completely different in the project, but it's kind of depending on how the CS Proj is ordered, you might get
Absolutely.
merge conflicts there. So
Yeah,
so much better.
just need to fix the solution files now.
Yeah, definitely. To be honest, I very rarely look at those now, but yeah, definitely got those GUIDs in there and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, you're a lucky man. I'm dealing with a solution that's got something like 90 projects in it. So the constant battle of when you add a new one.
Oh, yikes, yikes. So I guess that is one time where you probably do want that central package thing, maybe.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
So just thinking about other new features, like I say new, like .NET Core features. One thing I quite like is the .NET user secrets, which is quite handy.
Yeah, that was that 2.0, I think that came, or something like that, maybe. It was so there was the addition of the .NET tools, I think, had to come in first. So you've got the .NET SDK with the .NET CLI, so you can do .NET Run, .NET Build, but then they basically added the ability to add additional tools to that. And so you've got the EF Core one for migrations. You've got the user secrets, which, as you say, like is for storing secrets, so API keys, passwords, things like that you need to be in your application, but in a sort of a semi-secure way on your computer. They're not encrypted, and so they're not secure, but they're not. The important point is they're not checked into the repository. That's the key bit, so that you don't accidentally end up sending API keys into GitHub.
I think even things like if you're using that from the get-go or whilst you're developing before you've deployed anywhere. In the episode with Nick Chapsas, we were talking about GitHub Copilot. And he was talking about, well, the code you're working on is actually being synced to the cloud so it can do its magic. But if temporarily, before you deployed it anywhere, you're coding and hard coding secrets, then even though you've not deployed it anywhere, those secrets are still going out to the cloud.
That is true.
So from day one, just easily being able to add user secrets, it's not in your Git repository at all. And that's super useful.
Absolutely, and it's definitely a best practice. You should always be trying to use it, and it's got good integration into like Visual Studio and things like that as well. I think you can just go like right click on a project and look at user secrets. I use Rider, so I can't remember if it's in that or not.
I don't think it is actually. I tend to do when I do it because you pretty much only do it once. You do .NET user secret initialize whatever the command is, but I use the command line quite heavily as well, so I kind of like just do it from the command line.
Yeah, it's certainly easy to do that. There's also it's nice that it stores them as a JSON file. So if you do have the user secret and you say you need to add 10 secrets or something like that, you can just open up the JSON file where it stores it, paste them in there, and go with that, which can also be useful if you have sort of semi-secrets that you need to share with someone else and things like that. You can just zip up a JSON file and send it across.
I've just thought what I was saying about GitHub Copilot. What I quite often do with user secrets is I go to that folder where the JSON files are in and drag the file into Rider. So I've got a tab with those secrets in because then I can edit it and work with it. Even though that's not in the project, but I've got it in Rider, does that mean it's being uploaded? I don't know. I need to. I need to get Fiddler out and see what's going on.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't used Copilot actually. I've seen lots of things about it, but I haven't actually tried it.
It's so scary. As in, there's so many times where I've just been like, "How did you know that?"
Yeah. The thing that sort of concerns me about it is the sort of the complacency that I feel like if I'm not paying attention, I'll let things slip in. But it'd be so tempting to not pay attention when it gets it right 99.9% of the time. It's that 0.1%. I feel like a old curmudgeon, like being like, oh no, it's not going to get it right all the time. But yeah, I don't know. It's tricky.
I must admit, from my experience using it, it's not 100% right very often, but it's kind of, it gets you started to change. It's like, oh, that's an interesting way of doing it. And then you iterate on that. So I very rarely have had a suggestion that out of the box I've just used without doing any tweaks, but from a just saving on typing point of view, quite often where you get normal IntelliSense and then there's, so in fact, taking a step back for the listeners that haven't heard of GitHub Copilot, just mentioning what it is. So with IntelliSense, you get the incompletion for methods or property names as you're typing when you do dot. This doesn't autocomplete that. It autocompletes entire functions. So that's kind of why it's scary when you start typing and it gives suggestions for the entire functions. And this is kind of like using machine learning based on lots of code on GitHub. And then I believe it's learning from as people that are using it. It's learning on that as well. I don't know the full details. It'd be good to have a proper podcast episode on it. We did have a section in the episode with Nick Chapsas where we just, that episode we spoke about a few different things, but we had a section talking about GitHub Copilot. And he's actually got quite a few videos on it, which is definitely worth checking out. But moving on to potentially next topic, I mentioned at the start that I would love to dig into your blog post about, or not necessarily your blog post, but just the topic of ASP.NET on Kubernetes.
Aha. Yeah. So when I started at my previous role, they had a whole bunch of applications which were running .NET Framework, ASP.NET applications, and sort of one of the main things I was working on was porting these .NET Framework applications to .NET Core, and then packaging them up and putting them into Kubernetes. And the conversion from .NET Framework to .NET Core was a mixture of relatively simple and also horrendous, depending on exactly what sort of bits you were using. And at the time, it was tricky because of dependencies. We ran into quite a few issues. So this was in a .NET Core 2 time, when theoretically .NET Framework and .NET Core were meant to be on a sort of parity, like .NET Framework 4.6.1. Theoretically, you could use in .NET Core apps, but the reality was there was this sort of shim layer which you ran into, well, we ran into quite a few issues with mismatched package versions and things like this. So that was our biggest problem in that porting. Like the actual code, you didn't have to change much. It was mostly dependencies you're trying to fiddle with. But yeah, then packaging them into Kubernetes was almost the easy part in that it theoretically just sort of works. The nuances are many.
Especially if you're doing like a greenfield project, so like you mentioned about porting stuff across. But if you're literally file new project, like one of the projects I'm working on is a new Blazor project, and file new project, and because we've not really touched on it, I think most of the listeners know already, but .NET is now cross-platform, so it runs on Linux. So because it's just a Linux console app when it comes down to it, so it's so easy to just create a Docker image from it and then use Kubernetes to run that Docker image. I've got quite a few apps which are just running on Kubernetes. And you think like Kubernetes is this big complicated thing. There's one meme that I saw where it was this big massive truck which was empty and a little box in the middle on the back, like one of these cargo trucks with a little box, and the text said, "My blog running on Kubernetes." But in reality nowadays, I would agree with that if you were hosting your own and managing your own cluster. But all of the cloud providers now, you can pretty much click and create a managed cluster, which in Azure, it's kind of like, from my point of view, there's not much difference between a Kubernetes cluster and an app service plan, because an app service plan is managed VMs, which you can scale out. A Kubernetes cluster is managed VMs that you can scale out. But with Kubernetes, you just get a lot more flexibility and power, and it's so quick to deploy. It's insane.
Yeah, it's brilliant, especially if you're using those little Alpine images. It's like 40 megabytes or something for an application compared to, I was used to applications, just the DLLs are that, let alone the operating system as well. So, yeah, the difficulty you get to is there's a lot of, especially if you're porting from Windows to Linux, you've got, first of all, you're porting from Windows to Linux. So you have to make sure you haven't got any slashes the wrong way and idioms like that, so we had to fight with some of those initially. The actual Kubernetes side is, for the most part, like you say, it's just, you're just running an application. It's only when you really start trying to do a lot of stuff yourself and have fine control and add extra things like careful control of the liveness checks and things like this. There's a lot of subtleties which gives you a lot of power, but I think that's partly why people get overwhelmed. There's just so much to Kubernetes. I similarly saw a meme about like an iceberg essentially of Kubernetes, and at the top you've got pods and containers and deployments, and that's all okay. And then you go down a bit and you've got ingresses and services, and then you go learn that and you've just got everything. There's so much stuff to learn, which I haven't got the faintest idea about. The good thing is, as an application developer, you don't need to know almost any of that. Once you get to sort of services and ingresses, that's about as deep as you need to go, and as far as I've found anyway.
I think with that meme you mentioned, I saw it on Reddit, so then I took it and tweeted it out. I'll definitely include that in the show notes. But yeah, it's kind of interesting how deep that goes. I think also with like you mentioned about the basics, just understanding pods, deployment, services, ingresses, that kind of stuff, which is kind of like high up in that iceberg. That in itself, it's like, unless you've got someone explaining what those things are, then that initial learning curve is kind of, I feel that I've explained it to enough enough people now that I can explain it and get people to understand it. But it's kind of most people are just trying to learn for themselves and they don't have someone to explain like these concepts.
Yeah, I agree. It's difficult when there's a lot of content about Kubernetes out, but I don't know how much sort of first level, these are the very basics around things. If you look at the documentation for Kubernetes, like it's good in some respects, but also yeah, it's documentation written by people who clearly understand Kubernetes very deeply. So there's all of these sort of technically correct subtleties to it, which just I found quite confusing initially. I mean, even if you think about it, Docker containers, I don't know these days. I feel like most people understand containers, but that's a huge blind spot. I don't really know if everyone does sort of understand the concept of a container because I mean, what is a container? I mean, I couldn't necessarily explain it very well.
I think we'll be surprised because you and I are both in the community and we actively learn and keep up to date with the new and shiny and stuff. So we've probably been aware of containers since Docker suddenly became famous like many years ago. And I know I was certainly using it in a project way before most people had even heard of Docker. But I think we'll be surprised by how many developers are still stuck in .NET Framework land doing WinForms apps or web form apps and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's true. And for the most part, that doesn't matter. I think, if that's all you need, then it's great. But Docker in particular, like even if you ignore Kubernetes, I think Kubernetes is great for deployments. It gives you a huge amount of flexibility and control. But just Docker for local development adds so much. I mean, I was playing around with something yesterday where I was like, oh, I quite like to run SQL Server, but so Microsoft SQL Server. And I immediately got flashbacks to installing, like when setting up your laptop on the first day of work, and you sit there for an hour whilst Microsoft SQL Server installs, and it ticks over, and then I don't know, it was just a nightmare. So they now have a Docker image, a Linux Docker image, which I can run on my Windows laptop. So using WSL2, I just run a Docker run command, and I had a SQL Server running on my machine in 30 seconds, and like 28 seconds of that was downloading just downloading the Docker image. And having that capability with Docker is so useful. I think that's where people who otherwise don't really need to care about Docker can actually benefit.
Yeah, definitely. And you said 28 seconds of that was downloading the Docker image. One thing with Docker is the images are cached locally. So once you've done that once, if you do it again, it's 2 seconds all of a sudden.
Absolutely.
Extending Docker and using Docker Compose for local development, where you can have a YAML file which specifies, like your example of using SQL Server, I quite often use RabbitMQ as well. So on the command line, typing Docker Compose up, enter, from nothing can spin up locally SQL Server, RabbitMQ, maybe some other things like Azurite, the Azure Storage Emulator. That's an example, but it could be anything. The RabbitMQ could like this service, but also the developer UI, so you can see the graphs and things. And there's just so many images playing around with different stuff. One of my colleagues is currently doing a spike on a CMS, a headless CMS thing. I've forgotten the name of it, but whilst he was developing it, he just spun it up in Docker locally, and suddenly he had the user interface and he could interact with it. It just worked. I think Docker is just so powerful.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And you can run Kubernetes locally as well. Whether you want to is, I think the local development is not necessarily worth it. But I actually was running it locally, partly because it means you can more easily test your deployment scripts and things as well. So we used a lot of Helm for generating the vast reams of YAML that Kubernetes requires. And so if you're using Helm, you need to test it basically. It's sort of a program. I'm not sure if it's entirely like Turing complete programming language or whatever, but there's a lot you can do in there, and you need to be able to generate the YAML correctly to ensure that you're generating it. And at the time, Helm required a Kubernetes cluster to generate it. So yeah, we were doing that locally as well. But anyway, that's sort of beside the point. All you really need is Docker. that's the fundamental thing that people really. Yeah, I think it's just provides so much value.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you mentioned about you can install it locally. If you've got Docker Desktop installed, you already have it locally. You can right-click on the system tray and say Enable Kubernetes, and you have a local single node cluster just ready to go.
Absolutely.
It's very cool. With Helm as well, if you're using Kubernetes and not using Helm, you definitely should be, because you just get out of the box templating and a whole bunch of other stuff as well, where trying to do deployments with Kubernetes not using Helm and doing file string replacements and all that in the YAML file, it just doesn't work. So definitely use Helm.
Yeah, and there's a big argument about. I know people hate on YAML, and I do get it. As anyone who's spent 4 hours trying to fix a space in the YAML file, wondering why it's not working. I understand it. I wonder if we are going to move away from that though with things like Pulumi. I don't know if you've tried Pulumi. I haven't, but I've read a lot about it.
I'm the same as you. It's kind of, I've read a lot about it, but I tend to use Azure. So I've been doing a lot with Bicep, and I used to use Terraform, but I've not actually played with Pulumi. I should do, really.
So how does Azure play with Bicep if you're deploying to Kubernetes? Is it the YAML or is it Bicep or is it both?
So I tend to use Bicep for the infrastructure side. So deploying the cluster in the first place, deploying any managed identities around it, deploying. So with Kubernetes, I tend to host like applications like .NET services or web apps and things in there. But for databases, I prefer PaaS. So I'd use Azure SQL or Cosmos or just something like that. So rather than having the database and all its stuff in the cluster. So I would tend to use Bicep to deploy those data stores, any, I say managed identities, Azure Service Bus, all of this kind of stuff. But then I just use Helm to deploy applications into it, because it's kind of separating concerns with the infrastructure. You've got the deploying the cluster in the first place, which includes obviously the nodes and VM. Well, nodes are VMs for the listeners that don't know. So that's infrastructure deployed. So obviously you still want that infrastructure as code so that you can deploy different environments or tear them down and it's repeatable. But then I see like the Kubernetes deployment, so pods and all that kind of thing, as an application developer's responsibility. And I kind of don't use Bicep for that. Sorry, that
Yeah.
was a long-winded way of answering your question.
No, that's what I wondered about. I wondered whether even that was a possibility was of Bicep for Kubernetes, but that's where I sort of want postulate. I don't know if Pulumi supports Kubernetes directly or if it's for setting up the cluster as opposed to setting up pods and things. I just sort of feel like there's a need for that friendlier wrapper around the Kubernetes APIs, because it just feels hard for people to get into at the moment.
I guess, but then it's kind of once you start doing that, what's the point in using Kubernetes? I guess, because I also think like with ARM templates, if you go into the Azure portal, go to a resource, you go to export ARM template, you get this horrible blob of like ARM, which is just like yeah, and that's kind of that was my first experience of what ARM looks like, and it just put me off straight away. So that's kind of I moved to Terraform at that point. But then in reality, that isn't what you'd put in source control if you're creating it and doing it infrastructure as code, because that export includes way too much stuff. And the same applies with Kubernetes, where if you go to an existing pod or deployment or something and look at the JSON from that, you've got a lot more stuff than you'd have in your Kubernetes YAML files in source control or like in your Helm charts or kind of thing. So I don't know, when it feels to me like once you get the common concepts, like you have a YAML, which is a resource in Kubernetes, and you've got a type at the top specifying whether it's a deployment or pod or service or ingress or whatever. It's very consistent in the way those different patterns work. And once you get that, I don't think the YAML files are that complicated, because you just don't, especially when you wrap them in a Helm chart, you don't need to change them that much.
Yeah, I think that's the main thing. There is a lot of copy and paste. Like once you've deployed one application, realistically, you just copy and paste it, and then tweak a couple of values, and there you go, you're done. So there is that. I'd be interested to know how you've handling database migrations in your Kubernetes, because that's something that, especially if you have multiple pods and you're scaling up multiple pods, that can trip people up. And it took us a while to figure out how a process for that.
Yeah, with difficulty. Well, we tend to use anti-framework migrations, and then we'd have like something running in DevOps which would run that migration. But as you say, like depending on what you change in the database schema, there's different things that can change which have different outcomes. And I think the biggest thing is that developers working on it need to have thought through what happens when I deploy this. Do I need to make this database schema change in 2 passes so there's no downtime? That maybe adds a new column before deleting the old column and do that in 2 phases. I think just it's important for developers that are working on that kind of system to understand what happens with it, migrations, and think about the changes they're making and what's going to happen when that gets deployed to production.
Absolutely. I think that sort of 2 or even 3 pass for the database is something that doesn't seem to get spoken about a huge amount, but in practice, it's almost always something you have to do. If you're, say you want to add a new non-nullable column and you're like, well, my new application always sets that value, so it doesn't matter. But you're going to be running your old application and your new application at the same time. If you're going to have 0 downtime, that's just something you've got to live with. So you always have to add the column as nullable to start with, then roll out your application, then make it non-nullable. And then finally, you're sort of done. And if you're needing to delete another column, only once you've completely upgraded can you actually delete a column or anything like that. So yeah, it's one of those tricky processes. And especially this is where if you're not deploying frequently, this can be very tricky because now you've if you need to do 3 deploys essentially to completely roll out a feature, but you're only deploying every month or 2, then things are going to break.
I think that's the nice thing, isn't it? Like, I think some people get scared, oh, we're going to automatically deploy to production every day when you merge a PR or however your pipeline works. But actually, as you alluded to, the more often you do something, the less scary it becomes, and the smaller increments that change is.
Yeah. And obviously you can't just YOLO it. You've got to have tests in place. You've got to have, making sure things work. And this is where adding like health probes to your pods is such an important part of that, because you can catch very early on. You could make sure that your connection to the database is still okay. You could verify the schema even to make sure it's compatible with what you've got, so that you can essentially stop any bad deployments before they even have started.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned about tests as well. Going back to ASP.NET, I really like the whole web application factory for integration tests. I think I've mentioned it a few times in past episodes. And also going back to Docker, actually, one thing I favor now is in my tests, doing integration tests rather than unit tests in the pipeline or locally doing Docker Compose up. So it's spinning up my, mentioned before, RabbitMQ, SQL Server. It's spinning up real versions of those, not in-memory versions. And then it can run these web application factory integration tests. So you're actually calling your API, like in-memory version of your API, which talks to a real database. And then you can assert against the response, or quite often I then talk to the database directly in the tests to make sure that the database looks like I expect it to do after the act part of the test has happened. And I just find that's just such a more productive way of doing tests.
Yeah, I completely agree. I sort of feel conflicted in the unit testing thing, because part of me is like, well, okay, so if you're testing algorithms and stuff like that, unit tests fine. You should be, essentially testing a unit, and if that unit is a well-defined little self-contained thing, fine. You can test it, and you can get 100% coverage essentially on that, because you can test all the little branches. Great. But, in reality, most of us aren't creating applications like that. We're normally creating sort of sprawling, in some respect, services which have to service a whole bunch of things. They have to publish messages. They have to, like you say, write to a database. And if you abstract all of that out by mocking everything around, one, it just becomes very complicated, like trying to understand if things are working. And then when you change something, things just break. I completely agree. Like having those integration tests where you're using a real database, you're running the migrations against it as well. So if you can be sure that upgrading each of your migrations is going to work, that's a whole new test, which just works really well. And then using the web application factory just to sort of get that like subcutaneous layer of testing. So you're not actually quite testing it completely, because you're not doing the HTTP bit, but essentially all you've done is removed Kestrel, because you're like, I trust them to pass HTTP correctly and that sort of thing. So yeah, I completely agree. That's exactly the process that we took.
I've not heard that term in a while. Is that under the skin? So
Yeah, yeah. I can't remember where I heard it, but it seems to fit so nicely. You're not quite getting all the way through, but yeah.
I'm trying to remember where I heard it. I think it was a blog post by Joseph Woodward ages ago which mentioned it. So I'd forgotten about it. So I had to Google what it meant, and then under the skin testing, which makes sense because it's like the API layer just under the UI layer.
Exactly. And then this is sort of assuming as well that you are creating web APIs, which I think I don't want to say most people are doing, but I think it's certainly the way people are trending. Although there is a trend back, as far as I can tell now, towards having server rendered HTML, which I still have a soft spot for, with the Razor pages and all.
I think that's it. It's kind of there's so many different ways, and because Blazor's new and shiny, initially I was thinking, oh wow, how can I write everything in it? How can I write my blog in Blazor? When in reality, that's not the right fit for Blazor because Blazor's more a spa application. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I see it is if you've got like a blog or something where it's an article based or maybe even a news site or something, which is kind of, you want the whole page to be returned in one go, you want SEO working well, then you probably want to use something like Razor Pages, which is server side. But you probably don't want to write your blog in Blazor WASM or Blazor server for that matter.
Yeah, and so I'm completely with you. So if you want something which is sort of content based, Razor Pages makes perfect sense. And I mean, potentially, with a blog, you can get away with completely static content potentially if you don't have and you need to sort of authenticate and display different information and essentially have a server. If you don't need a server, then creating a static application is as good as anything. For, like you say, yeah, sort of content sites, HTML rendering is it's such an easier paradigm to get around that you've got one application that you're building. You're not building a front end application that then needs to talk to a back end application. So I don't know. I guess I see a trend back towards having server end applications because they solve a bunch of issues. The downside is that you generally lose a certain amount of interactivity. You're not going to have the sort of the nice flowing from page to page that you get with single page applications. So it's all trade-offs. Blazor Server is an interesting one though, because I know some people absolutely love it. I've not used it much, but essentially they talk about the productivity of being able to create a nice, essentially single page application. But again, you're down to one application that you're rendering. It's running on the server, so you don't have to worry about creating that API layer to communicate between front end and back end. So I can totally see that. I've always just been slightly afraid of that requirement for the persistent connection.
I think that's my thing as well. It's like if you're an end user that's on a train or something, they're going to be dropping connections and then they're going to not have a great experience with Blazor Server. And maybe it's worth taking a step back and just very quickly define, because I don't know whether the listeners know about all these different things.
Sure. So it was .NET Core 3, I think, introduced Blazor actually as a final product, and that was released as Blazor Server. So with Blazor Server, you have an ASP.NET Core application. So it's using all the same underlying dependency injection and extensions and hosting and things like that. And then you serve a single HTML file, and then there's a small bit of JavaScript that runs in that file, which then sets up a WebSocket to connect from the user's browser to your server. And from that point, all of the HTML generation and things happens on the server, and it's sent down the wire, down this socket in very small chunks, just sending the differences. So every time you click on or scroll or anything in the browser, it sends that event down the wire to the server, and the server then sends back an HTML diff. It sounds sort of terrible from a latency and just data point of view, but these are very tiny diffs, so it actually works really well.
So the DOM is managed on the server and then just sending the output of those DOM changes or the delta back to the client via a socket, effectively, signal R.
Exactly. So you've got the shadow DOM on the server, so it's sort of mirroring, it's keeping it in memory. So the more connections you have, the more memory you'll be using because it keeps those as persistent connections in the server. So there is that aspect you have to worry about. This is a stateful application. So if your server restarts, all of those users essentially their whole session is gone. They need to reconnect, start again. So it is a very different paradigm from a traditional ASP.NET Core application where you have every request is a just a completely stateless request being handled, and then that's it. It's done at the end of it. Blazor server is quite different.
We've spoken about the persistent connection, which is a requirement. Then, as you say, if each request is on the server, taking, even though I don't know how much resources per user that's storing, but the server's got to actually hold all that stuff. So it's maybe less scalable than another type of app.
I mean, it's sort of hard. It's kind of hard to measure, I think. So I remember they did some performance numbers, and I can't remember what it was, but they had something like 1,000 users per VM or something like that, and it could be quite comfortable for an arbitrary. I can't remember what the VM size was, but an 8 gig memory, say, was 1,000 users. Say one of the difficulties though is has to stay persistently connected to that server. So if you want to add a new server, you can have more users, but the socket has to be connected to that server. So it gets a bit more complicated managing those WebSockets. And that's where you can use a backplane to sort of service requests between the different servers and things. And Azure have a service for it, which sort of offloads a bunch of that for you. But that's where things can get a little bit trickier. Essentially, WebSockets are a bit harder to manage than stateless HTTP connections.
Yeah, I think the different places I would use the different types of Blazor, anything public facing, I would use Blazor WASM now. For if it was a internal tool within a company that you'd use in the intranet, as you say, it's much more productive because you don't have, using Blazor server, you don't have to worry about writing an APIs and the authentication and all that stuff because it's running on the server. So your front-end code effectively that's running on the server can make entity framework requests straight to the database. So from a developer point of view, that's super productive to knock up stuff. But you get the downsides we mentioned before. But I think for internal tooling like web apps, I think that's absolutely perfect. I personally wouldn't use it for public facing sites though.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's a slam dunk for internal stuff exactly for that reason. But externally, it's a bit trickier. Having said that, the WebAssembly is also it is a replacement for sort of spars like Angular and React and things like that. So in some ways, you drop it in public app and absolutely fine. The big problem you've got is just the size at the moment. It still can be quite large, depending on what you're doing, depending on how many DLLs you're doing, depending on how much tree shaking and AOT now in .NET 6 increase the size again. It's still not just like, just use WebAssembly. You do still have to consider the trade-offs of that. And do you need at all? Can you just get away with Razor pages? And then, you don't have any of that to worry about.
Yeah. I guess, like you mentioned with Blazor Server, and one of their performance tests were doing like 1,000 users on a VM, which probably isn't that much given the performance of ASP.NET without using that. There's that to take into account. There's, as you say, using Blazor WASM, it's quite big, but you've got tree shaking and AOT, but then there's a balance between that and performance. And it kind of feels like those two things are so edge case because most apps don't care that much. They don't have hundreds of thousands of active users at the same time and all this kind of stuff. Obviously, with the WASM is in performance in the browser, so that's not shared, it's per user. I think the important thing is all these different flavors that developers understand when you use what.
Absolutely, yeah. And the other thing, while we're just talking about all the different ASP.NET Core things, there was the gRPC, which isn't quite the same thing because it's not the front-end framework, but using gRPC to communicate between back-end services has become much more common, I think, these days, because it's a faster protocol generally than HTTP, but still gives you some of the same sort of, it feels very similar as an ASP.NET Core developer. It feels, pretty easy to create a gRPC endpoint. And so you've got to consider the differences between those as well for your back-end services, as well as this front-end side.
I have used gRPC with a past project, but I've not used it in a while. What's the tooling like nowadays? Because I know that, for example, when using normal REST, you've got lots of useful tooling like Postman and that kind of thing, where gRPC, obviously it's a binary protocol. Like, is there something like Postman for gRPC?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I feel like there must be, but there's also a setting where you can make it, instead of using protobuffers, it uses JSON instead. So that makes it a lot easier to see what's going over the wire, at least, even though it doesn't necessarily make it simple to send it over the wire.
Oh, so that's actual JSON, not serialized JSON to binary.
Yes, I believe. Oh, well, I think so. I could be wrong. Don't quote
Well,
me on that. I haven't done it for a while.
it'll be interesting to get Fiddler on that and see what's actually going on, or Wireshark or something like that to see what's going on under the hoods.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's just interesting, all these different options we have. So with gRPC, would you always default to gRPC for server calls now? Like, would you use it for browser to server, or what are the different use cases you would jump to gRPC instead of like REST?
So I think for browser to server, we definitely stick to REST. It is possible now with Blazor WebAssembly. So you can now use gRPC from the browser to the server, but it's not going to be supported everywhere, most likely. Plus, almost why bother? Like you've got all this infrastructure built up around sending HTTP requests to servers. It's not that big of a deal. Where gRPC really shines is when you need low latency, like fast, quick responses. And okay, you could make the argument that you need that on the web, but frankly, you don't know where your users are coming from. There's all sorts of other sources of latency there. Where it really shines is in server to server communication, I think, because then you've got also with the proto files, you have a contract, and you can continue to extend that contract, but you can generate a bunch of tooling around that. It makes it really simple for talking between, say, two C# applications, but also C# to Java or something. They can all using this intermediate proto file as the contract for talking between them. So I think that's very appealing.
Yeah, that's quite nice. I know, let's say, building like a microservice kind of architecture, so you've got lots of different services between different teams, and using HTTP. I know a lot of developers feel that they want to build like a client NuGet package which just strongly types the APIs and things. When actually with gRPC, you just get that, as you say, with these protobuf files.
Exactly. That's exactly the situation I was in before. Like we recreated, like you say, strongly typed NuGet packages for that. And the nice thing about those is that they could hook into the HTTP client factory stuff, which came in .NET Core 2 something. So you could benefit from a bunch of things in terms of that. But gRPC, you just have a proto file. It's just a simple text file. You just distribute. You could still distribute them all in a NuGet package if you want. If that's your mechanism for distributing it, that's fine. But it doesn't require any additional either manual client generation, or there's various generators you can use to create them. But that's all just handled automatically with gRPC tooling.
It does feel that you should be able to open up Postman and import a gRPC proto file. I'm going to Google it one second. So Postman gRPC. Oh, Postman now supports gRPC. This was January 2022, so it's recent. Oh.
Well, there you go. Next blog post.
This Postman blog post I will share in the show notes, but there's an animated GIF just showing. So it's new. It's not doing an import. Oh, it's already. So in Postman, it's specifying the URL to the gRPC server, the protocol, the version, and the method. Hang on, I'm just waiting for the animated GIF to go back. The method. Oh, so the method dropdown is automatically picking up. So it must get the proto format from the endpoint, and then you've literally got a drop down with all your methods that you can just call straight away. Oh, that's amazing. Nice. right, I'm going to rewrite all my services in gRPC
now. There is a danger with the new Shiny that people jump to this. And I think it is, if I was going to be doing new services, I would definitely go with it. But also, it's fine. HTTP, fine. Everything supports HTTP. It's easy to test. If you're using HTTP between your services, don't worry about it.
I think also just authentication and authorization, you've got the patterns around all that kind of stuff. That's kind of battle tested.
Absolutely. It is quite nice the way they've managed to plug gRPC in sort of almost parallel to the HTTP pipeline of ASP.NET Core. So it looks kind of seamlessly. You just do add gRPC, map gRPC, and it all kind of works. In terms of the authentication stuff and things, I can't remember exactly if that plugs in the same way, but they've done a nice job in creating those lower level abstractions and just iterating. Like I say, when I go back to the 1.0 post, I had a little look back just for fun, but you can see the progression it's really quite impressive.
With the authentication, it's been a while since I've done it, but I think it's gRPC's got a form of header, but it's not the same concept. So I think when I did it, there was a bit of setting that header manually for the auth token, but it wasn't complicated at all. But I'm sure it's moved on a lot since then. So we've spoken about comparing different versions of Blazor, WASM, Blazor Server, Razor Pages, so like the website technologies. We've spoken about REST APIs, web APIs versus gRPC. So you know what's coming now. Web API versus minimal API.
Yeah, so I think minimal APIs are great. That's my starting point, is that all of the work they've done in .NET 6 to slim down everything and make it a fast, or just a less confusing user experience to start with, I think is absolutely what is necessary to get people into it. As you know, I wrote a book trying to get started, and the first chapter is just explaining program and startup and why do we have two separate files and why does some stuff go in there and some stuff go in there. And it all makes sense. And especially when you look at the evolution of it, it all makes perfect sense. And if you're already using it, it makes sense. But for people who just come to ASP.NET Core and they're like, why all these files, nothing references anything. My weather controller is not referenced anywhere. How is it being called? My, startup file isn't referenced, or is only like this generic parameter. What's going on? So I think with the minimal hosting and the minimal APIs, that all just goes away a bit, and it becomes much easier as a user start experience. In terms of would I use it for a bigger project, I'm more on the fence. I feel like probably actually yes, because the way I normally do controllers they're very thin, and so they become minimal to an extent. And in that case, you may as well just use your minimal controller, delegate it straight to a handler, and then you've just got the performance benefit from using minimal APIs over using the MVC filter pipelines and things like that. So I think it makes perfect sense. I think we're still waiting to see what sort of patterns people come up with to not have 6,000 APIs in your program.cs, which I don't think anyone realistically is going to do, except in all of the demos they ever do for minimal APIs, which just, yeah.
I think that's the problem. When you mentioned about delegate to a handler, so what did you mean by handler? Because with the episode I had with Nick Chapsas, we had a section on minimal API, and we also had a section on mediator. So you can use, obviously, mediator for handlers, which is maybe a bit overkill. Well, I personally quite like it. But then he mentioned another library called fast endpoints, which is another way of using this, and it simplifies things a bit, but you still get this handler that does one thing. Do you do similar, or do you see a handler as just your own class?
So historically, I've had a controller, and when I start, I dump everything in the controller because it doesn't matter. If you're writing just a little sort of throwaway app almost, you start writing things there, it almost doesn't matter where stuff goes. But then as soon as it gets a bit bigger, I try and pull as much of that out into these separate handlers, which, like you say, have their one dedicated role to do. And the next step above that is introduce mediator, is what I tend to find. Because mediator is great, but it does add that extra level of indirection, which, if you're used to it, it's fine. And you can have patterns, having the things like nested classes for your request and response and things. That can simplify a lot of those patterns, I think. But sometimes it's just an extra layer of indirection when, essentially just doing a method call could work. And I think if you've just got a method call, that's where you can just put that into a minimal API. At that point, your controller isn't doing anything. It's just a routing mechanism. And then minimal APIs make perfect sense in that respect.
Well, so I like the whole handler pattern, and I'm pretty much using mediator for that. I don't really use it for all the other gubbins you get with mediator, which it probably is a bit overkill. I quite like it because it kind of enforces that consistency. But when it comes down to it, in .NET, you can just create a class and call it something handler.
Yeah.
And create a method in it called execute, and you don't need all that reflection gubbins around it.
Yeah, as things get more complicated, mediator can definitely be useful. So, for example, we had this sort of pipeline where the handler is responsible for sort of creating the scope, dependency injection scope. It creates either a transaction of sorts, and so you can do everything in your handler, and then it's only the mediator that sort of completes the transaction. And then you can use that for things like doing the outbox pattern and stuff as well. So as you reach sort of higher scale and as you more complexity and things, and you these are patterns that you sort of inevitably have to face at some point. And while just sending a message directly to RabbitMQ is sort of easier, ultimately you will end up probably needing to take an approach like this. And that's when having those abstractions that will handle all that for you can certainly be useful. And having that natural place to put in that pipeline, I think can be makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, definitely. Even like just a request generally has different things to do. So like you might have application level authorization, you might have validation, you've got the actual business thing, which tends to be reading or writing from a database. You might have logging and all those different responsibilities by putting them in different behaviors like PR processes in Mediator. You can actually separate those out. But then I guess like ASP.NET Core has middleware, which you can create a pipeline as well. So it's not like you have to use Mediator to have those benefits.
No, absolutely. And like I say, that those benefits all feel like things that come later. Like you don't start with this unless you already have this infrastructure set up for a different application, and then you're sort of copying and pasting fine. But for the most part, you add these in slowly. The middleware pipeline could be a useful place for it, but the middleware pipeline handles every request, like every request, even if it doesn't get routed to an endpoint and things like this. So a lot of those I think make more sense at the request level. A lot of them do, like authorization makes perfect sense to be at the middleware level.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point. You get your request or when you're delegating to Mediator by specifying the Mediator request object, and then you've just got completely separately a Mediator pipeline with these different behaviors and the main handler as well. I think that is quite nice. But yeah, there's so many different ways to do it. It's like the Fast Endpoints project that Nick Chapsas mentioned looks really interesting as well, and the whole getting rid of that extra layer of abstraction. There's just so many different ways to skin a cat. That's why our industry is so interesting. There's so many different ways of doing things. You never stop learning, which is why I love it.
Absolutely, completely agree.
Which is where awesome blogs like yours comes in really useful.
I'm just glad people find them useful. To be honest, it's nice.
Yeah, definitely. So we probably should start wrapping up now. But just going back to your blog, you've got quite a few series of things, and just reading out a few of the top ones. You've got a whole series on exploring .NET 6. You've got a series on creating a source generator. You've got a series on a deep dive into string builder. You've got like creating a simple moving average calculator in C#. As we've already mentioned, deploying ASP.NET Core applications to Kubernetes. So there's lots of really interesting stuff. So yeah, to all listeners, just go, as long as you're not driving, stop now, go and click subscribe. So we've actually not mentioned your book, have we?
Yeah, ASP.NET Core in Action, the second edition, anyway.
Yeah, and Manning have very, very kindly offered to let us give away a copy of your book. And they've also given us a permanent 35% discount on any of their Manning books. So I'll put it in the show notes, but their discount code for any of their books is podunhandled21. But for the winner of your book, which is ebook, then what we're going to do is if anyone that wants to take part can send out a tweet about both the podcast and Andrew's book. So use the hashtag unhandled exception so I can find it. And maybe in a week's time or something from when this gets published, we'll just pick one out at random.
Sounds good. Yeah. So I just want to say, the book it uses .NET 5. So some people are like, .NET 5, it's obsolete now. You got .NET 6. The reality is that it's the same. And there's all the newer stuff like the minimal APIs and the new minimal hosting. So those aren't covered in the book. Instead, it uses the traditional program startup, and it's always been focused on server-side rendering, so like Razor Pages, basically. So it sort of depends exactly what your focus is. If your focus is getting started in ASP.NET Core, I think this is a good option because then you're going to need to know about startup. I think that's the other thing we forget is that even if we use minimal APIs now and the new hosting, anyone who does ASP.NET Core is going to need to know controllers and program in startup because that's what every application up to now is using. But yeah.
I guess you hinted on the fact that not much has changed using the latest .NET, and I guess we haven't really covered the whole upgrade story because .NET now, I think it's every November there's a new version of .NET, and so they're iterating quite quickly. And I know when I've upgraded like .NET 5 to .NET 6 for some projects, for the most part, it's literally been a case of open up the CS Proj, change one word, and suddenly it works, and you get all the performance benefits and all the new and shiny. And then, because I use Rider generally, or I'm sure Visual Studio does the same, you then get like the ID suggesting, saying, even though it's not breaking, so you can deploy straight away, you get stuff saying, oh, you can now use file scope namespaces or whatever it is. And I just find that it's just so quick to upgrade. So even though they're iterating quickly, most of the time it's not breaking stuff, and it's so quick to upgrade.
Yeah, I completely agree. So 1 to 2 to 3, that they were all big jumps. Like that was all tricky to go through. But from 3 to 5 to 6, it's been exactly that. It's been as simple as just changing a couple of references, and that's it. And you just get all the benefits. Like they did add a lot. It seems disingenuous to say it's all the same, but they've added a lot of stuff. The difference is they haven't broken anything, and everything that worked before is still there and still works perfectly well. You can still use the original hosting from .NET Core 2 in .NET 6, and it'll tell you it's obsolete, but it still works.
Yeah, I think there's actually a tool called the .NET Upgrade Assistant. I've never tried it, but I believe that can upgrade like quite old projects to all the different versions. It sounds a bit too good to be true. As I say, I've never tried it, but I believe that is an option. Again, I'll include a link to that in the show notes as well if anyone's interested. So shall we do dev picks?
Sure, yeah. So my dev pick is a plugin for Rider, because I know you're a Rider fan. So mine is the heap allocation viewer, which is a plugin for Rider and ReSharper, and it highlights whenever you have an allocation in your project. So when you call new, yeah, analyze it. That's a likely one. But whenever you get a boxing conversion from a struct to a class, it highlights that. Whenever you capture a closure and things like that, it highlights it all. So if you're doing performance related stuff, it's very useful. It just sort of highlights all these bits where you would otherwise have just not thought about at all.
Yeah, it is very cool. So with Rider, I'm probably a bit OCD in the sense of it's got to be green in the top right to get rid of all the warnings and everything. And whilst turning on this tool, so you can see underlines and everything when there's allocations, I very quickly turned it off because it was scary because you can't get rid of them all everywhere. And I've got to have green and no warnings. But it is so useful, especially as you say if you're doing performance stuff. But it's amazing just seeing like where the allocations are though, just from an interest point of view.
Exactly, it's a lot of these boxing conversion things you just wouldn't necessarily think about if you're adding a string to a character, for example. Then suddenly you've got this boxing conversion you don't necessarily think about.
Yeah, cool. So in fact, I'm going to do 2 picks today because one is a quick one, which I've mentioned before anyway, but because we've spoken a lot about Kubernetes, there's a GUI which is free called Lens. I don't know whether have you ever used Lens?
No.
It is amazing. I'll send you a link in a bit, but it's basically a free GUI that sits on top. Like behind the scenes, it's probably calling all the kubectl commands like you normally would, but it just makes it so much easier to work with Kubernetes. You can click through all the different types like pods, deployments, or whatever. You can see if you've got any custom resource definitions, you can see all those. You can click on a pod, slider bar to scale out the deployment, so you can scale out the pods. You can click on a pod and click on a button to see all the logs. You can basically do anything you can think of from this just GUI, which is really nicely designed. So yeah, I'll include a link to that in the show notes as well. But because I've already mentioned it, I thought because we're talking about Kubernetes, I thought I'd mention it. But my other pick is, well, it's not really a dev pick as such, and it's just general reading. But because we're talking about blogs, I thought it was worth calling out. And I'm sure everyone's heard of it. It's just called getpocket.com. It's not new, but I just find it super useful for throwing articles I want to read into it. So in the browser, I can if there's a blog post, maybe one of Andrew's that's awesome, which all of his are, I can right click and say save to Pocket, or if there's even documentation. If I've got some documentation which I need to read for something I'm doing, I can right click and add to Pocket, and then I know that I've got effectively a magazine of articles I know I want to read. And so, as I say, it's great for lots of different things, blog posts, articles, documentation. But then I actually read those on my e-reader device, which I've got something called an Onyx Books Nova 3, I think it's called, which I can share in the show notes. And it's effectively an Android device with a screen like a Kindle. So I get headaches if I look at a tablet. But it's just brilliant because I can just open that up, open up the Pocket app and read from a massive list of things that I know I want to read. There's no way I'll get through everything in my Pocket account, but I just know there's always something I want to read there. So it's really useful.
Excellent. I use the approach of having 6,000 tabs open at all times.
Oh, I do that too. It's kind of one pixel per.
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. So before we do sign off, I've got to ask, in your Twitter name, you've got Sock.
It's been a nickname from when I was, I don't know, about 12. And it's not exciting. It's just because my surname is Locke. And for 12-year-olds, it was funny for people to call me Sock. So
it's stuck.
That's it. Yeah, and now literally everyone.
Fair enough. So before we wrap up, where's the best place for listeners to reach out to you if they have any questions or they just want to...
So I'm on Twitter, Andrew Locknet. I'm on LinkedIn, or you can email me. It's all on my blog, so at andrewlock.net.
Fantastic. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been an honour having you on, and I knew this episode would take a few tangents, but it has, and I've so enjoyed it. So thank you very much.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
No worries. And thank you everyone for listening. A quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter at Drakan, and my DMs are open. And my blog, danclark.com, has links to all my social stuff too. And we'll include links to all the things we've mentioned in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.